Okay, so Andy, yell out if you can't hear me. Otherwise, I'm just going to proceed. Um, so thanks for the intro, Andy. And before I start telling you about what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, there's some credit needs to be shared here. The presentation you're about to see is very definitely a shared effort between Brian Roth, the new director of EFGRO, and myself. And a lot of the recent science that we've been doing around long-term impacts of herbicides on forest, uh, the forest community, is very much a product of a shared effort between myself, Jula Gulyash, and John Nash. And so I'm here as a spokesman, not as the owner of what you're about to see. And Andy, if we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is really how we got where we are with herbicide use for reforestation, some of the emergent challenges to the use of herbicides for forest management and to herbicide use more generally. And then I'm going to offer you some thoughts and some suggestions on if you want to continue to use herbicides for forest renewal, how you some options you might examine. Let me put it that way. So Andy, if you could give me the next slide, please. Andy showed a slide this morning that said, wow, look at that. Herbicides really took off in 1996. Well, if you're as old as me, you were around to see that happen. And what happened was that Alberta was under a de facto moratorium on the use of herbicides for forest renewal between about 1985 and 1995. And with the emergence of the sort of competition related regeneration standards that came into effect in 1991, it became apparent that those standards couldn't be met without a significant amount of stand tending. And the forest industry made very clear that herbicides were an important part of that stand tending package. And as a consequence, there was what was called a go slow process where herbicide adoption in Alberta was scaled up over time, and people were given relatively small areas to use herbicides on to develop experience until they could scale up. And then once they scaled up, there was a big effort to catch up with a backlog of competition control on openings that would need to meet that 1991 standard. And as a consequence, that big spike Andy showed us, and then the falling off. Part and parcel of that spiking up was that we recognized fairly quickly that applying herbicides by air over retained structure meant we really had to do a lot better job of risk management and risk reduction. And I am pleased to say Alberta led Canada in that, and also in an effects-based approach to monitoring both the risk and the outcomes of herbicide application. Next slide, please, Andy. Now, I'm not talking through my toque when I say that. I mean, this graphic comes from a paper that Sonia Odson, Daniel Chiquan, and I published about 10 years ago. And what we looked at is the herbicide excursion intensity. So that's the number of herbicide excursions per 1,000 hectares sprayed. And we looked at both a cumulative number and also at a sort of scaling of it. Did we affect water? Did we affect the no deposit zone? Did we simply spray outside the block boundary? And what we see here is that far and away the bulk of off-target applications are essentially edges that were treated, so spray outside the block boundary, and you can see the intensity is generally pretty low. So clearly that risk management process that we developed is working. Next slide, please. Now, as we move into the current situation, why did we do this? Well, there was a really strong emphasis on conifer in the 1991 regeneration standard, and emphasis on conifer that was considered free to grow, which means conifer without adjacent competition. And when we go back to blocks that were treated in that era, and what you're seeing here is 7 blocks that were treated with herbicide, 1 in the late 1980s, and blocks 5 through 10 all treated in the mid-1990s. And we remeasured these blocks in 2019. And the reason that these blocks are of interest is that each of them contains roughly a hectare of area untreated with herbicide, but that otherwise received the same silvicultural regime as the rest of the block. So we're able to sort of tease out the differences in a bunch of things, in deciduous volume, in coniferous volume, and in biodiversity between the treated and untreated 25 years post-treatment, which is, there's not a lot of data goes out to that far out, and in particular, not a lot of data around biodiversity. And as you can see here, clearly herbicides did exactly what we wanted them to do from the standpoint of fiber. We produced more conifer and less deciduous. So we shifted the allocation of site resources toward the conifer side. And that's exactly why we did this. Next slide, please, Andy. But, and this is a really big but, when we talk to stakeholders about herbicides, they don't generally give a rip about whether or not we're putting a lot of conifer back on the landscape. They're more concerned about a bunch of other values. They're concerned about berry plants. They're concerned about forage for ungulates. They're concerned about plants that are considered medicinal plants. All those sorts of attendant values to the forest, and those values hinge on biodiversity. So when we redid this measurement, like I say, we did plant community descriptions in the treated and the untreated areas, and then we compared them. And we started out by simply using a student's t-test, and what we found was that we didn't have sufficient data points. So we used something called permutation, where we essentially bootstrapped the data set, and we built 2,500 iterations of the data within the bounds established by the sampling, and we used both the treated and the untreated. So we permuted the entire population, and then we looked at the t-test in the face of that. And what you're seeing here is the permuted distribution of Shannon-Wiener diversity index and evenness, and then you're seeing where the red line is where our assessment fell. So what you're seeing is our assessment fell well within the bounds of normal distribution, and what we found is no differences in either of those two indices of diversity. Next slide, please, Andy. That said, I mean, I've been telling you a really good news story. We've got the conifer response we wanted. We're not having a massive effect on biodiversity in the long term. I would say, though, that what we've done is we have come to rely on broadcast herbicide application much more than we really should. And certainly this is the sort of treatment that causes a lot of concern, a lot of upset on the part of stakeholders. And this puts us at risk, and in particular in a time when there's concern being expressed about herbicides, and in particular about glyphosate, which, as Andy told us this morning, is over 90% of the forest herbicide used in Alberta. Next slide, please, Andy. And what are some of the drivers of this change? Well, there's all the uproar around glyphosate and the fact that the International Agency for Research on Cancer concluded glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. What the folks that are prompting this uproar neglect to tell us is that a joint special meeting of the World Health Organization and Food and Agriculture Organization came up with a completely different conclusion, which is that it was unlikely that glyphosate caused cancer in humans. And I'm not going to get into all the discussion of the toxicological rationale here. I will say, if you're interested in that, get a hold of Mark Coulin at Wolf and get access to the Len Ritter video set that Wolf has, because Len is an eminent toxicologist and he talks to this issue. But what I will say here is that this finding by IARC, coupled with a number of class action lawsuits, has put tremendous pressure on glyphosate wherever it's used, and in particular on the use of glyphosate in the forest. Next slide, please, Andy. Another driver of change is that we as foresters, in particular silviculturists, have tended to think of forests as trees. And the vast majority of stakeholders see forests as a loose fabric of trees around which a whole cloth of forest is woven by a whole bunch of other biotic factors, other plant species, wildlife species, human uses, spiritual values. And what we've done in forestry, and this is my perception, and feel free to disagree, but what we've done is we've tended to look at those other values and treat them as constraints. Here's what we'd like to do, but we're not going to do this particular piece because of wildlife habitat supply or because of a stakeholder concern. And by doing that, we do two things. We build resentment on our part that we're not able to do all the things we wanted to do because we're being constrained just by definition. And we give stakeholders the sense that we're grudging and that we don't recognize the values that they recognize as having equal importance to ours. And we're moving into a world of conservation offsetting, a world of exchanging ecosystem service values. And I just spent a couple days this week actually on the phone with people who are talking about transacting ecosystem services and looking at how that would work in a forested environment. And these people aren't other foresters, and they're not stakeholders, they're bankers. So, ultimately the world is moving to a world of ecosystem services, and forests provide a wealth of ecosystem services. And as silviculturists, we need to start thinking in terms of that web of values and the ecosystem services it provides. Next slide, please, Andy. And, I've been there. We didn't recognize the depth of stakeholder concern back in 1985 when we were looking to really scale herbicide up to operationalize it in Alberta, and we had a de facto moratorium imposed on us for 10 years as a consequence. And if you look across Canada, herbicide use is declining substantially in pretty much every province, with two exceptions, and those are New Brunswick and Alberta. And I don't think we are going to have the privilege of being outliers to that particular phenomenon much longer. And recently, my co-author, Brian, who recently moved back to Alberta from Maine, has been working with folks in Maine around a proposal from one of the state senators in Maine, who proposed a complete ban on aerial spraying of herbicides in forestry because glyphosate might be one of the herbicides applied. So there's a lot of pressure on herbicide use and on sort of herbicides as business as usual in reforestation. Next, please, Andy. So, I'm going to now offer you what I think is a path forward. And that path forward is that we need to be more integrative in how we think about the forest. We need to think in terms of that web of values I've been talking about, and we need to start incorporating those other values into our planning and our practices and into our conversation with the public and stakeholders. We need to help people understand that, in fact, we're thinking about forests, not strictly about trees. Next slide, please, Andy. And there's Tyler talked about application technology this morning, and I know there's some folks who've done some work here recently in Alberta around using drones for spraying, and I personally was involved in an effort to operationalize a 4-rotor drone for spraying. And I must admit that didn't work out very well. And there were a couple of big reasons around why drone spraying didn't work. One was the endurance of battery-operated drones. And the other was the amount of dirty air a 4-rotor drone creates made it very hard to generate a consistent array of droplets and then manage that array of droplets to the ground as a spray swath. But having said that, I think we may have been using the wrong drone. I'm thinking that it would make a lot more sense to have been examining something like this Yamaha remote control helicopter. And in fact, a friend of mine in Ontario is operationalizing one of these for spraying brush under white pine shelter woods this coming season. Next slide, please, Andy. And Tyler showed us his ground broadcast system here earlier, and I'm simply going to reiterate what Tyler said about that. Ground broadcast spraying will let us rethink spraying on the ground. It will give us much more precision in delivery than backpack spray will. I've struggled mightily for years with trying to make backpack spray more precise and more predictable. And the other thing it will do is it will let us engage ground spraying with that sort of spatially explicit, precise silviculture Tyler was advocating for. So in fact, what it will do is it will turn backpack spray or ground broadcast spraying into something that we can direct and record using GPS guidance, which is, in my opinion, one of the huge innovations in forestry over the course of my career. Next slide, please. Another thing we need to think about is the array of herbicides available to us. Tyler touched on that this morning. We already have several herbicides available to us in Canada for forestry. Besides glyphosate, we have imazapyr, we have flazosulfuron, we have triclopyr. I'm holding my nose as I say this. We have hexazinone. And I think what we need to do is start understanding those herbicides and recognizing where their strengths are, where glyphosate's strengths are, and rather than trying to make glyphosate a one-size-fits-all, be more prescriptive both in where we use herbicides, how we use herbicides, and which herbicides we use. And one of the nice things about some of these newer herbicides is they're much more specific to herbaceous species, which lets us target more at the level of herbaceous versus woody, rather than we've got to kill the grass, so that means the aspen's going to die too. Next slide, please, Andy. And we have to reimagine our engagement with First Nations. I mean, we're in a time where First Nations are wanting a place at the table. They're wanting input and some sense of control around particularly the landscape they engage with, and that in many cases, most cases, is forests. And we need to establish a relationship with them that lets us understand what it is they want. So rather than going to them saying, this is what we want to do, what do you think? I'm suggesting more of a two-way conversation. We're trying to grow a forest. What values do you want out of that forest, and how do we go about getting to that sort of an outcome? So engaging at a much more basic level than our current consultation process takes us to. Next slide, please, Andy. And you know, to help you folks with that, this whole engagement thing, FGRO has developed a bunch of material out of that remeasurement we did of the old herbicide trials, and that's available to you right now as field tours, and it will soon be available as a story map. And parallel to that, Brian is heading up an effort in participation with Jeff from Hinton Wood Products to develop a risk communication package to not only provide you the information, but provide you the tools for delivering that information in this sort of more basic approach to consultation I'm advocating for here. Next slide, please, Andy. And, you know, I really think, folks, that we've done an incredible job of renewing forests. You look at the image on the left there, that's a forest where we used herbicide. The image on the right is, you know, maybe a mile down the road, and same silviculture prescription with the exception of using herbicides, two completely different outcomes. But when we talk to stakeholders about it, we want to talk about the whole array of outcomes you see there, the biodiversity, the browse, the habitat, not just the conifer. Next slide, please, Andy. And, you know, I hear things about density management and genetic improvement and how we're going to go the next step in forest productivity. I raise a caution that I think these are tremendous ideas, and I think they're really good ideas, but I think we need to think about these ideas as how they would enable having that conversation about the wider array of ecosystem services that comprise forests. Next, please, Andy. And, you know, I really think that my advice here is learn from what's happened with the herbicide world and engage with stakeholders about what you're talking about in terms of density management, tree improvement, all these other things earlier rather than later. Next, please, Andy. And, you know, I leave you with the Chinese proverb, you live in interesting times. And I would have to say that, I mean, I've had a fairly long career in silviculture. It's been pretty varied. And the one consistent thread is it's always been interesting times. And I would encourage you to think of interesting times as opportunity rather than adversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Milo. That was an excellent presentation. We have time for one question. I hope I get your name right, Mihajolovic. So Mihai asks, in 1985, Pfizer Corp was in the business of providing advice on rates and application technology for herbicide on the Procter & Gamble FMA in Grand Prairie for vegetation management. Would you happen to know what was the commercial name for that Pfizer herbicide?
Yeah, Mihai. Actually, it wasn't just Pfizer Corporation. Dow Chemical was involved, Monsanto was involved, and DuPont was involved. Pfizer was recommending that product called Esteron 3-3E be used. You may have heard of that product under its military designation, Agent Orange. Dow was talking about triclopyr, Monsanto was talking about glyphosate, DuPont was talking about hexazinone and phosamine ammonium, both of which continue to be available. And that trial underpinned the push to operationalize herbicides in the mid-1980s, and that push resulted in the moratorium I talked about earlier.
All right. Thank you, Milo. That takes us to the end of the time. We appreciate you taking your time out of your busy retirement schedule to come visit with us.
You're welcome, Andy.